Humanists this afternoon, especially if this is your first time. If it is your first time, it's always helpful to know how you heard about it. So what I'm going to do is just read out very quickly a list of the possibilities and just a show of hands if that's how you found it. So, advertiser or local newspaper? That's about 2. Okay, fair enough. Internet? Oh, no one, okay. Yes, one, 2, yeah, okay. Fabians? Sometimes the local Fabians join us. Word of mouth? Okay, good show of hands though. We love that because that costs us nothing. How about Cafe Philo today? Yeah, 1, okay. Swanage discussion group? Hooray, good. Other? Right, other. What was that one? What's the other?
Well, I come to this centre anyway.
Oh, this yes, I forget that, that we have posters up here as well. So, excellent, thank you very much. Well, if you are a visitor, don't forget to leave your contact details so that we can keep you in touch with our future events, or pick up the programme as you leave. If we need to vacate the hall in an emergency, there are 3 ways out of here, behind me, down the main corridor, or behind you, and we assemble in the car park if we need to. There are toilets down the main corridor here, or at the back of the hall. If you come along regularly to our meetings, then please do, if you haven't already, please do consider becoming a member for just £12 a year. We've got some membership forms on the table at the back, and Dean will be standing by, ready to give you any information about that you might like. There's a colourful bowl by the door for any donations that you feel that you can give. Around £1 or 2 would help us with our expenses today. Do have a look at our leaflets, and we've got a fantastic Dorset Humanist library at the back of the hall. We don't give you very much time in the break, but if you get an opportunity, do go and look at the books on humanism, atheism, science, and various other topics in our library. If you have any questions about humanism or Dorset Humanists, do have a word with anyone wearing a name badge or anyone who looks vaguely friendly. If you can help with distributing our posters, we do have a few posters of our events, again at the table on the back. They're the big sort of A4 posters. Don't just take one and shove it in your pocket. They are, if you think you can display on a notice board somewhere, then that always helps us. We'll have a break for 20 minutes at 3:30 today. Just time to grab yourself a cuppa. And then at 10 to 4, if you would like to stay, no obligation, but if you'd like to stay, we have our Part 2 meeting. And today we've got a couple of things on the agenda. First of all, I'd like to know at this stage if you have any ideas for this year's Christmas appeal. Now, last year we had a Christmas appeal and we raised £800 for the St Paul's shelter in Bournemouth for homeless people. If you have any ideas about what you'd like to do this year, then that's your opportunity is today to express your ideas. A couple of members have also expressed an interest in the topic of Syria and what kind of response humanists might give on that particular topic. Now, we're not going to be able to solve that particular problem in 40 minutes, obviously. It seems to me that maybe we can actually join those two topics together. We might even want to make Syria a Christmas appeal, a sort of humanitarian appeal, or you may think that local charities would be preferable. So it's up to you. Come back and have your views on that. A couple of news items. First, news from the Vatican, which you may have come across. Pope Francis was asked whether a Christian God forgives those who do not believe in God and who do not seek faith. And surprisingly, he said yes, as long as they behave morally and live according to their conscience. So what we're going to do is send him a good without God badge. Or maybe even a t-shirt. Now the second piece of news is that for as long as I can remember, in Dorset Humanists, we've been saying that humanists should be represented at the Remembrance Service in Bournemouth. Now, Richard Scott has been negotiating with the council for about 2 years, and this culminated in a meeting at the council yesterday. To our amazement and delight, they finally agreed to our proposal. So I will be standing alongside the vicars and the rabbis on the 10th of November at the cenotaph, and I shall be reading a short poem on behalf of people with no religion. So please do come along and support me, otherwise they might change their minds, especially if they get lots of complaints. So after the event, you must all write into the council and say how marvellous it was to have a humanist representative at the cenotaph. And that was a round of applause for you, Richard. Where have you gone? He's at the back. And credit where it's due, the person who actually swung it in the meeting was the town centre vicar, the Reverend Dr. Ian Terry. He was really on our side. There were a couple of opponents that he really swung it, and we were quite amazed at the end with that result. So there we are. Okay, what's coming up next? On Wednesday the 25th of September we've got our evening meeting at the Greenhouse Hotel, and the next one is called What is Humanism? That's me explaining yet again what humanism is. I've got a few new things to say, so even if you think you know what humanism is, you don't know what I'm going to say this time, so come along anyway, give us some support on that evening. And then in a month's time here, we've got Rory Fenton, who's the Dialogue Officer for the British Humanist Association, talking to us about whether atheists and faith groups can work together constructively. So that should be interesting too. Now, our speaker today is Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and head of their Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit. Not sure if you've all heard of anomalistic psychology, but there we are, you'll hear about it today. He's a former editor-in-chief of the Sceptic magazine, he's a fellow of the British Psychological Society, and his work has been widely published in numerous academic journals. I'm sure many of you will have heard him on the radio or seen him on YouTube. I'm delighted that he's come to speak to us today, so will you please give a very warm welcome to Chris French.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak today. Thank you to all of you for coming along to listen. As you just heard, I did for around about a decade edit the Sceptic magazine, so you've probably got a pretty good idea of where I'm coming from on matters paranormal. But I think an important part of Scepticism is to always be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. And it's an important part of science, and Scepticism is at the heart of science. So even though you might hold the beliefs that you hold today for very good, rational and empirical reasons, it's always possible that some new evidence will come along in the future that might lead you to have to revise those views. And so with that in mind, I always like to start these talks by doing a little test to find out just how psychic my audience is. So I'm going to try and transmit a thought from my mind into your mind. So I'll keep it very simple. I'm going to try and transmit a number between 1 and 10. Not 3, because that's too obvious. So the first number that comes into your head between 1 and 10, but not 3, make a mental note of it now. Now, I'm not sure how many there are here. It's a nice big number. But obviously we'd expect some of you to get it right just by chance. So we'll only get ecstatically excited if it's more than about 10% of you. Okay? So could you just raise your hand if you thought of the number 7? Whoa. You were quite excited. Very well, very impressive. Now I'm encouraged by that. I'm going to try a second one. This one's a bit more complicated. This time I'm going to think of a number. It's less than 50. It's 2 odd digits and they're not the same. Okay? So it could be 15, 1 and 5, both odd digits, not the same. It couldn't be 11, both odd digits, but they are the same. So the first number that fits that description. less than 50, 2 odd digits, and then not the same. First number coming to your head now. Okay, did anybody think of the number 37? Okay, that's not bad. Did anybody think of 35? I'm sorry, I thought 35 first, then I changed my mind. That's my fault, I confused you. Now, is that any kind of evidence for the existence of telepathy? Well, no, it's not. What it actually is, technically speaking, is something called population stereotypes. There are various situations where it feels as if you are making a free choice amongst a number of different response options, and therefore your intuition tells you that the frequencies across those different options ought to be more or less equal. But it just doesn't work like that. We know that responses will cluster in predictable ways. The first example, typically about a third of your audience will go for the number 7. In the second example, typically around a third of your audience will go for the number 37, and about another quarter typically go for 35. So you can present this as if it involves something paranormal, something psychic, but obviously it doesn't. That doesn't prove that psychic forces don't exist, but it does show that there are situations where you might think something paranormal is happening, where there's actually alternative explanations. There's a very famous Israeli psychic who's very fond of suing people, who used to appear on TV a lot in the 1970s. And one of the things that he would do is he would say, I'm thinking of a simple line drawing and I'm beaming it to the viewers at home telepathically. Any offers as to what that simple line drawing was? Yes, somebody said straight away, a house. About 10% of your audience would go for a little house. You know, the children's drawing of a little house. If you've got millions of viewers, that's a lot of people sending in their pictures of a little house to the TV station. So they cover the wall with these pictures showing just how telepathic Uri, who's got to give away, really is. And of course, it doesn't matter what Uri Geller was thinking of, 10% of the audience would have drawn a little house. You can exploit this in conjuring tricks as well, in magic tricks. So one more little demonstration like this. This time you can be really tricksy. Don't just, I want you to pick a card, but I don't want you to go for the first card that you feel drawn to. You can change your mind, you can suddenly change, but eventually I want you to focus on just one card and concentrate on it. Okay? Now here comes the magic bit. I'm going to take one card away, and I predict that your card is gone. Put your hand up if your card is gone. Oh, what a predictable bunch you are! Now actually, that trick isn't based on population stereotypes. The first demonstrations genuinely were, that one's not. You can figure it out for yourself if you haven't already how that one was done. The point here is, there's a little lesson even here. There are certain mentalists and conjurers who do amazing performances, and sometimes they will explain to you how they've achieved a particular effect. And sometimes they tell you the truth, and sometimes their explanations are what we psychologists technically refer to as a load of old bollocks. The name Derek Brown just came into my head there. I don't know. Right, okay. Right, on the main part of the talk then, what is anomalistic psychology? Well, it may be defined as the study of extraordinary phenomena of behaviour and experience, including, but not restricted to, those which are often labelled paranormal. It's directed towards understanding bizarre experiences that many people have without assuming a priori that there is anything paranormal involved. It entails attempting to explain paranormal and related beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences in terms of known or knowable psychological and physical factors. So most of the research that we do is about starting from the working hypothesis. Let's say, for argument's sake, we assume that there are no paranormal forces, that paranormal phenomena don't exist. How can we explain all of the weird kinds of experiences that people definitely have? And that's our starting point, and we try to then devise theories about that, and we try to put those to the test, and we see if we can use empirical evidence to support our explanations. But we don't take a kind of strongly hardline position whereby we say we know that paranormal forces don't exist. As I said before, I don't think that's a properly scientific attitude. My personal opinion is that they don't, but I could be wrong. Maybe next week, next year, next decade, parapsychologists will come up with some absolutely incontrovertible proof. I don't think they've done that so far. But maybe they will. So with that in mind, there is another strand to our research whereby we directly test paranormal claims. So I'm going to start off by giving you 2 or 3 examples of that, and then I'll talk about the other line of our research where we try to come up with non-paranormal explanations. So the first example here is a clip from the Richard Dawkins series, Enemies of Reason, where we were putting dowsers to the test. So I'll show you the clip and then I'll make a few comments about it.
Alleged paranormal effects. The so-called evidence for psychic phenomena is not robust, but will-o'-the-wisp. The more we look at it, the weaker it becomes. The alleged detection of water through dowsing is not obviously ridiculous. It might work, but does it? The only way to tell is through a rigorous experiment.
How does dowsing work? That's the number one question, and nobody can answer you. Well, I'm convinced that something is happening to douse. One of the earlier chaps thinks it's God.
How do you do it? What's your principle of that?
I think the question, and I expect God to respond in the way that I understand. I will expect the right hand one to point to the camera and the left hand one straight forward.
Yeah, okay.
Look, it's following round.
Have you done the test yet in the temple?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, and what was the result?
I was going to get 6 or 800%.
Yeah, and what happened? So what do you make of that?
He's having his laugh, isn't he? He loves a joke. You don't realise. Do I get second guys?
The psychologist Chris French thinks there may be a simpler explanation. He has devoted his career to investigating claims of the paranormal. And now he has set up this test for dowsing, a properly controlled double-blind trial. In each of these rows, just one container, chosen at random, holds a bottle of water. All the rest contains sand. Neither the dowsers nor the tester are allowed to know where the water is until the boxes are opened, so there are no unintentional giveaways. Safeguards like this make the double-blind trial one of the crowning achievements of scientific reason.
What you'll typically find when you talk to dowsers is they'll give you lots and lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of stories about how they discovered a leak in their neighbour's pipes and so on and so forth. But there are always other possible explanations there.
Yes.
What we're trying to do is set up conditions which rule out any of those other explanations. And then we get down to the very fundamental basic issue: can the dowsers actually do what they think they can do?
Yes.
I think it's 4. No, I think it's 4.
So shall we see how well you've done?
This is sand. In that case, I can't do this.
This is the water to number 5. Sand again. This time, guess what's in number 3? And this time you're correct. That's water.
In that case, I'm 100% wrong again.
We got 1 right on out of 6, which is what we'd expect by chance. So far, they're performing pretty much in line with mean chance expectation, in other words, guesswork.
Yeah.
So no one has scored more than 2 hits out of 6.
3.
The people you've been testing, do they understand why they're being put through the double-blind procedure?
I think once we've explained it to them, then they appreciate why someone who is perhaps sceptical or doubtful about their claims would see that that was necessary. What's interesting is it doesn't actually tend to dent their confidence at all.
You suggest that they're completely sincere.
I think they are completely sincere.
Yes.
And they're typically very, very surprised when we run them through a series of trials and actually say at the end of the day, well, your performance is no better than we would expect just on the basis of guesswork. And then what typically happens is they'll make up all kinds of reasons, some might say excuses, as to why they didn't pass that particular test.
I feel the whole test is wrong.
I'm shocked
beyond my words that this has happened. But I did say from the outset, couldn't we just sort out some grey blocks and some scaffold walls so that I can walk above it, which is what I routinely do and I've done for 40 years.
Yeah.
Who knows where or what bottles were in what tubs?
That's the whole point, isn't it? That's the whole point.
But if you understand dowsing like I do, you'll understand that everything leaves an image.
This state of denial is extraordinary. Even when confronted with hard fact, these dowsers prefer not to face up to truth, but retain their delusion.
Now, I mean, in general, we're very happy with the way that our test was portrayed in that programme. One little qualification that I'll come to in a minute. We were very pleased to take part for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, we were going to be doing that test of dowsers anyway as part of National Science Week. And when people making the programme got in touch with us, we thought fantastic, you know, the whole thing will reach a much wider audience, which clearly it did. It was also a very simple test. I much prefer nice, simple tests. There was no need for any kind of fancy statistical analysis. It was just, if the dowsers could do what they said they could do, they ought to have been able to pass our test. And they all signed a statement in advance of the test saying that they thought it was a fair test. Also, you've got a situation there where it was illustrating a really fundamental scientific principle, double-blind testing. So again, in educational terms, that's great, telling people about double-blind testing. The one kind of qualification to all that was that there was an important part of the test that they didn't show at all, and that was before we did the formal double-blind testing. With each and every dowser, we said we want to make sure this is a fair test. So here's a bottle of water, here's a bottle of sound, just make sure you get the reaction you expect. And so over the water, a nice dowsing reaction, over the sound, nothing. Okay, that's great. Now let's put those bottles inside containers and shut the lids. They still know the water's here and the sand is here. Over the water, nice reaction. Over the sand, nothing. So it's only when we then do the double-blind test that their performance falls a chance. What is it that explains the reaction that they get when they know where the water is? It's something called the ideomotor effect. It's non-conscious muscular movement. They are, in fact, moving the dowsing rods themselves, they're just not consciously aware of it. The same phenomenon applies with Ouija boards and in other similar situations. Anyway, so that's one example. Another example from last Halloween, this was the Halloween Challenge 2012, where these two lovely ladies, Kim Whitten and Patricia Putt, both professional psychics, agreed to be tested under properly controlled conditions. And so we did this test. This is Mike Marshall of Merseyside Skeptics, Simon Singh, the science writer, and me. Oh, and even though it's a very simple test to describe, to actually carry out properly involved a lot of people, so there's pretty much the full crew that were involved on the day. So a very simple test. If psychics really can do what they say they can do, they say they can tell people all about themselves just using their psychic powers. Now, if they could do that, the idea was we get 5 volunteers to come along, we get our psychics to write down a reading for each of our volunteers, and then we get the volunteers to come back and read through the readings. So there were 2 sets of 5, and they had to choose the reading that had been done specifically for them. There ought to be one reading there that relates entirely to lots of specific personal detail about their lives. There's a little bit more to it than that. These are 3 of our 5 volunteers. You'd obviously do a very different reading for an 80-year-old man compared to a 14-year-old girl. So we insisted that all of our volunteers were between 18 and 30 and they were all female. But even then, you do a very different reading for somebody that you could see looked like they worked out down at the gym compared to somebody who maybe was kind of overweight and blah blah blah. So again, we took the precaution of having our sitters behind a screen. Okay, there's no communication between the two. They just wrote down the reading. And again, they were very happy to do that test. There's no point in doing a test if they say, well, I can't do it under those conditions. But we say, fine, let's not bother them. It's not going to tell us anything. So how did they actually do? Well, then they came back, as I say, and they rated each reading. How did they actually do? Well, we set quite high criteria. Oops, got to give away. We set quite high criteria for success. We said they had to get 5 out of 5 to pass the test. But 4 out of 5 would have been statistically significant. We would have acknowledged that, and we said we want to test you again. We're really interested. We might be onto something here. How did they actually do? Kim Whitten got 1 out of 5. Patricia Cook got none. So no evidence there for any kind of psychic ability. Needless to say, they decided it wasn't a fair test after all. This is a kind of example of the more experimental control type parapsychological study that we've done. I don't know if you remember, there was quite a hoo-ha in the science media back in 2011 when this guy, Darrell Bem, a very well-respected social psychologist at Cornell University, published a paper in a very well-respected mainstream psychology journal, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which appeared to support the idea that people could somehow sense future events before they take place. Precognition, in other words. 9 experiments, over 1,000 participants. 8 of the experiments produced significant results. So this got massive coverage around the world, internationally. This was even before the article was officially published, even when it was just online, and there was a second wave of publicity when it was actually published. And to his credit, Ben said that he wanted other people to replicate his work to show that these were genuine effects. So we decided, he even very kindly made his software available so that it made it a lot easier to attempt those replications. 3 of us, myself, Richard Wiseman, at the University of Hertfordshire, and Stuart Rich at the University of Edinburgh, we agreed we would each carry out an independent replication. We didn't, to be honest, really expect to get significant results, and surprise, surprise, we didn't. I'll just describe the experiment that we actually did. Each of Ben's experiments were based on what he called time reversing standard psychological effects. I'll just give you one example, the one that we actually based, or that we did. If I were to give you a list of words, let you look at them once, and then test your memory for them, you wouldn't perform as well as if I give you the list of words, let you look at them several times and rehearse them, and then test your memory. Okay? Common sense. According to Ben, you will get a difference in terms of the number of words recalled, even if you don't do the rehearsal until after you have been tested. Now, again, this doesn't make any sense at all in terms of standard psychology or conventional physics. It does mean, I think there's going to be the fact that students would do a lot better in exams if this were true. You know, you could sit the exam and then do the revision afterwards, you know, when you already know what the questions are. I don't think it worked. But anyway, that's what Ben was claiming. So this was the experimental setup. 48 words presented one at a time, then a recall test, 5 minutes, write down as many words as you can remember. Then half of those words are randomly selected and presented again as practice words, and half of them are not. So control words were presented once. So this is the extra rehearsal phases. And according to Ben, somehow this extra rehearsal can reach backwards in time and influence the performance on the memory test at this point. Now, as I say, it doesn't make any sense. Our results didn't support it. There have been other failed replication attempts as well. It got interesting when we sent our paper in to the journal that had published the original paper, because the editor said, "Oh no, we're not interested in this, we don't publish replications." Didn't even send it out for review, just said, "No, we don't want it." We thought this was a bit much, given this had such coverage, was such a controversial finding. We thought failed replications were actually quite important here. But you wouldn't be moved. We've got the same treatment with 2 other high-impact journals. The British Journal of Psychology did send the paper out for review. One referee said, "Yeah, really important paper, publish it straight away." The second referee wasn't so keen, had various kinds of concerns about the paper. And we could tell from what was written, we thought we knew who the second referee was. It was Darrell Bem. We thought there was a bit of a conflict of interest here. And Ben, to his credit, agreed with us that it should be sent to a third referee, and that person made the decision. But again, the editor would not be moved. In the end, we did get it published in an open access journal, PLOS One, and we managed to get quite a lot of media coverage for it, so we were quite happy. But it does illustrate a very important aspect of science publication, that there is a huge bias here. What high impact journals want is positive results, and they don't want just replications, they want novel results. And that completely distorts the whole scientific literature. A lot of the effects that are published in psychology journals may well not actually be genuine robust effects. A lot of them are, but they're mixed up with a lot that probably aren't. It was quite interesting that we got more coverage for our attempts to get our paper sent out for peer review than we actually normally get when we actually publish something. So Ben Goldacre wrote a column on it for The Guardian, the New Scientist covered it, and the Psychologist covered it. And again, this was just our attempt to try to get the paper sent out for peer review. We weren't saying, oh, you should definitely publish it. We were saying, just send it out for peer review. But anyway, eventually we did get it published. And it then fed into an ongoing debate in psychology at the moment about the whole problem of replication for certain kinds of effects. So there was a kind of good outcome from this. Anyway, there's just 3 examples of our attempts to try to replicate paranormal effects. There have been others. We've tested lots of psychics, and generally, the results just don't hold. Just don't produce any evidence of the claims. So why are we interested in this stuff then? You still sometimes come across the attitude from some scientists who can say, why are you interested in this stuff? And we all know it's nonsense. Why are you wasting your time on it? Well, if you actually look around the world, every society that you care to pick, both geographically and historically, there will be people who hold these kinds of beliefs. And there will be a sizable minority of the population who claim that they have had direct personal experience of the paranormal. So, as a psychologist, there's something there that needs to be explained. Either this indicates that paranormal forces really do exist, and if that's the case, then we should get over our prejudices as scientists and just study these phenomena and these paranormal forces in the same way that we study any other aspect of the natural world. Or if, in fact, paranormal forces don't exist, we can learn a huge amount by studying these experiences and trying to explain what is going on and learn a lot about human psychology. So either way, it's worth taking these kinds of experiences seriously and trying to understand them. So that's what we do. Now, one of the things that runs through anomalistic psychology is that of cognitive biases. Cognition is just the way that we process information, the way we remember things, the way we perceive things, the way we form judgments, processes involving language, etc., etc., etc. And without waxing too lyrical, our cognitive systems are absolutely amazing. We take it very much for granted, the things that your brain can do every second of your waking life, that as yet, no computer can do. The computers will get there, but at the moment, there's still a lot that you can do that a computer can't. But we also know that there are certain systematic biases in the way that we process information that cause us to misperceive, misremember, misjudge information. And it may be that some of these are relevant to explaining why in some situations we think something paranormal has happened, but maybe it actually hasn't. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of that. First one is the poor estimation of probability. We are all really lousy, intuitive statisticians. Okay? There are lots of situations in everyday life where we have to make judgments based on probabilities, and we're just not very good at doing it. Now, why is that relevant? Well, very often when somebody is telling you about their paranormal experience, a standard skeptical response might be, well, maybe it was just a coincidence. So, the experience of you thinking about somebody you've not heard from for a long time, the telephone goes, you pick it up, and it's them. Is that some kind of spooky psychic link between the two of you, or was it just a coincidence? Or you have a dream about something, and a couple of days later something happens in real life that bears a striking correspondence to the dream. Was the dream some kind of glimpse into the future, or again, was it just a coincidence? Now, I think a lot of the time we don't like coincidence as an explanation for a number of reasons. One of them is the emotional impact that that kind of event has. I mean, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, if something like that happens to you, you get that kind of wow moment, and you tell your friends about it, it's something you'll talk about, okay? And so when some boring old skeptic like me just says, oh, maybe it was just a coincidence, you don't really feel that that's doing justice to the experience that you've had. But you may go a step beyond that. You may in some situations be able to at least guesstimate the actual probabilities involved. And they may literally be millions and millions to one. You may say, you know, the chances that I would have that particular dream and then that would happen in the next couple of days are astronomically low. And you may actually be correct in saying that. But when you think about the nature of coincidence a bit further, you'll realise that actually a lot of the time it probably is just a coincidence. Think about the number of people who you think about during the day, and the phone either doesn't go, or the phone goes and it's somebody else. You don't even notice that, it's a non-event. It's only when the phone goes and it's the person you were thinking of, you think, oh wow, that's spooky. Now it may be that, you know, that there are other factors than just probability and coincidence involved. It may be there are hidden causes. Maybe the night before on the news there was a story about some aging rock star being rushed into hospital. And that got you thinking, because you used to really like that guy and his band, and you used to go and watch them when you were at uni, and you're thinking about your best mate that you used to go to concerts with, and you've not heard from that person for a long time, and you start reminiscing just more generally about the good old days. And the next day you're still kind of in that reminiscence mood, and the phone goes and it's that person, they called you. Now by this point, you've forgotten why you started thinking about them. Okay? And the thing is that they saw the item on the news last night as well, and that's why they've been thinking about you. Maybe you should get in touch, and they've just got around to it before you have. But both of you have forgotten the actual cause by then. And so it's got this kind of spooky, paranormal kind of feeling to it. Or think about the precognitive dreams. There are over 7 billion of us on the planet, and we all dream every night. What would be really spooky is if no one ever had a dream that then seemed to come true. That would take some explaining, that would be weird. The fact that it does happen is exactly what you'd expect on the basis of the law of large numbers. The chances of winning the jackpot in the National Lottery, 1 in 14 million. Most weeks somebody wins, simply because so many people play. The law of large numbers is that you have enough opportunities for very rare correspondences to occur, they will occur. Okay? So, how psychologists looked at this kind of bias. One very popular example is what's called the birthday problem. How many of you have heard of the birthday problem before? 1 or 2, yeah. The basic idea is how many people would you need to have at a party, just randomly selected, to have a 50-50 chance that 2 of them would share the same birthday. A little word of caution here. If you are organising the party, don't just randomly invite people. It would be a rubbish party. Okay, nobody will know each other, have nothing in common, they just don't do it. But if you were to do it, what would the chances be? If you just got 2 randomly selected people, you've got 1 chance in 365. But ignore leap years to keep it simple. 1 chance in 365 they have the same birthday. If you have 366 people, you are absolutely certain you've got at least 1 pair with the same birthday, because if by some strange fluke the first 365 all had different birthdays, you've now used up every day of the year. The next person must match somebody. So there's a number between 2 and 366 where you've got a 50-50 chance of having at least 1 pair with the same birthday. If you ask people, they'll typically say 180, 200, 120. The actual answer is 23. That's all you need, 23 people. I saw Simon Singh talking about this at a conference in Dublin. He had a really neat way of demonstrating it. He got the people in the audience to shout out their birthdays until he got to the person who said, my birthday's already gone. And that happens half the time before 23 and half the time after 23. And he got about 17 or 18 people through, and somebody shouted their birthday out, and Simon said, that's my birthday. And he had his passport with him so he could prove that it was his birthday. I thought, that's pretty neat, I'll nick that. I'll use that next time I do a talk. So next time I do a talk, I try the same thing, went right through the room without a single match. So I haven't done it since. But honestly, the stats is right, the probabilities are right, it's 23 is the right answer. Now another reason you might be, that just reminds me, if any of you Advertisement break. If any of you are interested in novelist psychology, we do have a book coming out in November, and you can get a 15% discount if you use the code that's on these forms, on the leaflets at the back and at the front. Okay. Another reason you might actually be convinced that paranormal forces really exist, that people have these amazing powers, is because you've actually been to see a psychic. And they have given you a reading, they've told you things about yourself that they couldn't possibly know any other way. That's the line everybody always uses. Well, again, maybe they really are psychic, but there are other possible explanations. There is a technique known as cold reading, which is used by deliberate con artists to convince complete strangers about them. It's a very useful technique, obviously. You want to set yourself up as a fake psychic. I teach a course on anomalistic psychology at Goldsmiths as part of our BSc degree. And I teach the students all about cold reading so that when they graduate and they can't get jobs, they all get jobs, obviously. But cold reading involves an awful lot of different aspects. One very central part of it is something called the Barnum effect. And what the Barnum effect is the tendency that people have to accept vague, general and ambiguous statements as being descriptive of their own unique personalities. There are certain kinds of statements that sound as if they're very perceptive of your innermost personality, but actually apply to everybody, or pretty much everybody. So I'm going to read a typical Barnum profile now. You have to do a bit of role play. You've got to imagine that I'm doing this reading and it's just for you, not for anybody else. Okay. So is this an accurate description of you? What I'm sensing, what I'm picking up from your vibes? You have a great need for other people to like you and admire you. You do have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity which you've not used to your advantage. While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. Disciplined and self-controlled outside, you tend to be worrisome and insecure inside. At times you have serious doubts as to whether you've made the right decision or done the right thing. You prefer a certain amount of change and variety and become dissatisfied when hemmed in by restrictions and limitations. The next line is my favourite. You pride yourself on being an independent thinker and do not accept others' statements without satisfactory proof. You have found it unwise to be too frank in revealing yourself to others. At times you are extroverted, affable and sociable, while at other times you are introverted, wary and reserved. Some of your aspirations tend to be pretty unrealistic, and security is one of your major goals in life. Now, it's a great classroom demonstration. You tell the students that a friendly local astrologer has agreed to draw brief personality descriptions on the basis of their birth details, and you can all sealed envelopes, and you get to open them and read them and rate them on a 5-point scale for accuracy. And first everybody will give it a 4 or a 5. And you might say, yeah, hang on, Mr. Smarty Pants Skeptic. The reason they give it a 4 or a 5 is because actually it is accurate. That's describing the human condition. Most people are like that. Psychopaths maybe not, but most people are like that. So it's why shouldn't you say you give it a 4 or a 5? It's a good point. The thing is, if you say to people, how general is that description? To what extent does it describe everybody? And to what extent does it describe you as a unique individual? People think it describes them as a unique individual. And to say it doesn't. There's lots of statements. That's all kind of related to personality. There are other kinds of Barnum statements. Richard Wiseman told me one that I thought was very good. You're doing the reading and you say, I'm getting something about an unfinished book. It's a really clever one. I mean, if that person happens to be writing a book, you have got a major hit. They will be so impressed. They're just think of a book they're halfway through reading, or a book they tried to read and gave up on. But everybody will have something. It's either a minor hit or a major hit. It's a guaranteed hit. And there are lots of lines like that. Now, you can obviously do the Barnum type. I mean, that profile was first put together in 1949, and it still works like a treat today. There's lots of, you can use those type of statements for padding out your readings, but there's a lot more that you can do if you're in direct face-to-face contact with someone. By the way, one thing I should make clear before I forget, I'm not saying that all people who claim to have psychic abilities or to be astrologers or tarot card readers are deliberate frauds, because I genuinely don't believe they are. The vast majority really do believe they have a gift. And I think they're fooling themselves as much as they're fooling anybody else. There are some people who are deliberate frauds. Sorry, I just cleared my throat there. But the vast majority are not. And in my opinion, it's my personal opinion. But what you do find is that if you're in direct personal one-to-one interaction, there's a lot more that you can do. So once per month, you'll find that if you analyse lots of these interactions, the psychics ask an awful lot of questions, which is a bit weird because they're supposed to be telling you stuff, but they actually ask you questions, because the way they do it is actually quite subtle. So on one occasion for my sins, I had to pass myself off as a psychic on Richard and Judy, and I had this volunteer there who was having a reading, been told that I was a psychic. And I said to her, I told her that I was in contact with the spirit of her dearly departed granddad. And I felt a bit awkward about it. I did apologise to her. The thing is not trying to make people feel stupid, it's trying to just illustrate. If you just tell people about the technique, they won't necessarily be convinced that that really would work. You actually have to demonstrate it. But at one point during this interaction, I said to her, was your granddad a tidy man? And she said, yes, he was. Yeah, I thought he was. He had a nice taste, didn't he? If she'd have said no, I'd say, no, I don't think he was. And then he used to put things away, did he? You know, it sounds from the question as if I'm asking for confirmation of something I already know, but actually I have no idea at all. I mean, you answer one way, I'll go that way, and you answer the other way, I'll go that way. But again, in skilled hands, and I would not claim to be a skilled cold reader, but a skilled cold reader can be really, really impressive, even if you know they're using cold reading. Anyway, one of the things we've got very, very interested of late is memory, because typically you are not dealing directly with the paranormal or ostensibly paranormal event or experience itself, you're dealing with someone's report of it. And that raises all these issues about the reliability of eyewitness testimony. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the massive amount of research that shows that people misremember details of staged crimes and so on and so forth. Might be slightly more surprising that even memory for simple everyday stimuli, things that you have seen literally thousands of times in your life, can also be inaccurate. How is the 4 represented on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them? Is it like this clock here, I, or is it like this clock here, IV? How many people think it's I? A few of you. How many people think it's IV? The vast majority of you. And obviously I wouldn't be asking the question, the vast majority will get it right, would I? I'm a psychologist. On clocks and watches, but only on clocks and watches, the 4 is usually represented in this very unusual way. And every time you see a clock or a watch from now on with Roman numerals on, you'll think that's smarty pants. There are a few exceptions. I know, you don't need to email me about Big Ben, I know. But the vast majority are represented like this. Now, it's a very simple illustration of the fact that memory does not work like a video camera. You can't just think back to the last time you saw a clock or a watch with Roman numerals on and think, oh yeah, I see, that's how it looks. Memory is a constructive process. So when I ask you that question, you think, well, power 4 is represented in Roman numerals. And quite rightly, you think IV, because that's how they usually are. But on clocks and watches, they're typically not. So it's an example of what we call top-down processing, where, well, top-down processing doesn't always lead to errors. Whenever you are interacting with the world around you, you've got 2 sources of information. You've got information coming in from the senses, which we call bottom-up information, bottom-up processing. But sometimes that information can be ambiguous, and in order to disambiguate it, the influence of top-down processing, your knowledge, your belief, your expectations about the world interact with the incoming information. You end up with kind of on this mental model of the world around you and your place in it that you're constantly updating. But the top-down processing can be more influential if the stimuli are either inherently ambiguous or degraded or whatever it may be. And I'll show you a few examples in the perceptual domain later. But for now, just to say that the way it illustrates in a very simple way the way that your beliefs about the world can affect your memory. Now, memory conformity is something that we've looked at. This is the phenomenon whereby if you've got just a single eyewitness to an event, and it's uncorroborated by anybody else, you probably would not give that as much evidential weight as if you had a number of eyewitnesses and they're all telling more or less the same story. And that's probably a very sensible thing to do. But one thing to bear in mind is that if people have just witnessed something unusual, like a crime, or a possible sighting of a UFO, or a ghost, or a Loch Ness monster, they're going to discuss it with each other. And one person's account might influence another person's memory. Now, this has been looked at in a forensic context, and it's been shown under properly controlled conditions that does in fact happen. And of course this is really important if you're talking about criminal cases, because the single biggest factor in wrongful convictions is faulty eyewitness testimony. Okay, we shouldn't give it as much credence as we do, but it's very hard not to. It's very natural. We've got somebody there very confident saying, I saw this. You tend to believe them. Anyway, we wanted to look at this in an anomalistic context. So what we did, we replicated an experiment that was first reported by Richard Wiseman and Emma Greening. I'll describe that experiment because it's an interesting experiment in its own right. What they did, lots of people who saw Uri Geller doing his standard spoon-bending type performance, when skeptics said, well, this is just a magic trick, it's just sleight of hand, some people said, no, it can't be, because I saw him do it, and I saw him put the spoon down on a table, and it carried on bending, and he wasn't even touching it, so it can't be sleight of hand. Now, conjurers would say to that, there are ways of making people think the spoon's carried on bending, and really it hasn't, just purely by the power of suggestion. So Richard looked at this in a controlled experiment. Half the part, what Richard was saying, showed this video, and the interesting part came after the conjurer had bent the key using sleight of hand. He then puts it down on the table, and you hear him say, if you look closely, you'll see it's still bending. The other condition was exactly the same, except you didn't get that suggestion. Okay? Those who got the suggestion, about 40% of them report they think the key carries on bending. It's a really simple manipulation with a very big effect. Those who didn't get the suggestion, virtually no one reported the key carried on bending. So Richard found that in 2 experiments. We borrowed, he lent us the recording we used in our study, but we found that the believers, the people who believe the paranormal, were more susceptible to the suggestion than the non-believers. And we also threw in a memory conformity component. We had people watching the video in pairs and then discussing it. And one of the people who watched the video was actually working with us. They were a stooge, and they were instructed to either say that it did carry on bending or it didn't. And what we found then was that if you got the suggestion from the psychic and it was then reinforced by the co-witness, we got to levels of 60% of people then saying that they thought the key carried on bending. Okay? So it's both things that are happening at the time you witness an event and things that happen afterwards that can influence your memory. Okay. I find this slide increasingly depressing because it was 10 years ago that I actually published a review of the relevance of research into eyewitness testimony for reports of anomalous experiences, and also the relevance of research into false memories for reports of anomalous experiences. Now, false memories became a very hot topic in psychology as a consequence of the controversy that arose back mainly in the 1980s, mainly in America, but it's still ongoing and it's around the world, including the UK, of people going into therapy for very common psychological problems, things like anxiety, depression, problems with relationships, whatever else it may be, low self-esteem, with no memories of ever being the victims of childhood sexual abuse. And by the time the therapy had finished, They were convinced that they were the victims of childhood sexual abuse, typically at the hands of their own parents, and they had vivid memories to support those claims. The question is obviously, are those recovered memories accurate, or are they false memories? And the one silver lining to come out of this whole horrible situation, I mean, it tore families apart, people ended up going to prison, etc., etc. The one silver lining was that it generated a lot of research about how susceptible we might be to false memories. Now we now know, we've got at least half a dozen, probably more, techniques that you can use to study this under control conditions, and people are much more susceptible to false memories than we would necessarily have expected. Typically, in these kinds of studies, about 25% of the people that you try it on actually start to report memories for things that never actually happened at all. There's lots of variations, lots of different techniques, but that's the general picture. It means that we now can look at what kind of variables correlate with susceptibility to false memories. And it turns out it's things like dissociativity. And dissociativity is a kind of tendency that some people have to go to get mildly altered states of consciousness. But I mean, to be honest, the best description is they're the kind of people that my grandma would have said were away with the fairies. I mean, you know what I mean by that. You know, I mean, that's what we're talking about with dissociativity. Fantasy proneness. People who have very, very rich fantasy lives, often very creative individuals, spend a lot of time daydreaming, spend a lot of time engaged in fantasy. Absorption. People who, when they're engaged in an activity like watching a film or reading a book, they just shut off the outside world, they become completely immersed in it. Hypnotic susceptibility. All of these things intercorrelate with each other. They also correlate with susceptibility to false memories, and also, interestingly, they correlate with paranormal belief and the tendency to report paranormal experiences. And this raises at least the possibility that some of these experiences they're reporting might be based on false memories. So we wanted to study that a little bit more directly. We gave 100 participants, we being myself and Chrissy Wilson, my postgrad at the time, we gave 100 participants a news coverage questionnaire. If I were to say to you, who were you with, where were you, what were you doing when you first saw the footage of the Twin Towers collapsing, I'm sure you'd all be able to tell me, and you'd all be very confident that this was an accurate memory. It turns out that even those so-called flashbulb memories are not as accurate as we once thought they were. So that's another story. I can't talk about that today. It looked like we were doing a study of flashbulb memories. They're called flashbulb memories because it's obviously as if the event is so traumatic it burns itself directly into your memory. But we were a bit tricksy. We asked people those kind of questions. Where were you? Who were you with? What were you doing when you first saw these dramatic pieces of news footage? But we included one event that hadn't actually been caught on camera. In this case, it was the footage of the first Bali bombing, CCTV footage of the first Bali bombing, because there was a second Bali bombing that took place after our study that was caught on camera. But this one wasn't. There was no footage. So we're asking people, can you remember when who you were with, what you did when you first saw this footage? There is no footage, but they don't know that. And what we found was that 36% of our 100 subjects would say, yeah, I remember seeing that footage. They'd tell us who they were with, what they were doing, where they were. They'd tell us whether the footage was in colour or black and white, whether there was a commentary, if so, what language it was in. They'd comment on the quality. We'd go to rate the quality of the footage, in terms of picture quality. They did not get paid more if they remembered. And interestingly, the ones who said that they could remember scored higher on measures of paranormal belief and experience. And we've replicated that effect. It's been replicated by other people, so it does appear to be a reasonably robust effect. Okay, how many of you have seen this video footage? I'll show you a brief video clip. How many of you have seen it before? A few. Okay, so this question is only directed at people who haven't seen it before. The instructions are very simple. I want you to just count the number of times that the players in the white shirts pass the ball to each other. Okay, how many times? 14. Yeah, very good. More importantly, maybe more interestingly, did you notice anything a little bit odd about that video clip?
2 balls.
The 2 balls, that's not what we're going to do.
Somebody seemed to come on the screen from the right that I didn't see the first time.
Right. Alright. For those of you that have just seen it the first time, be honest, how many of you didn't see the gorilla? Put your hands up if you didn't see the gorilla. Okay. I promise I'm going to show you the same clip again now. Just watch it. Don't bother with the counting. Now, I suspect that if I'd said to you before I showed you that video, do you think you would see a gorilla walking through the middle of that activity? Of course I would. You know, stupid. Yeah, of course I would. But people don't. That was first. That was a classic experiment that's begun now. It's referred to as the gorillas in our midst experiment. And it was first reported by Simons and Chabris back in 1999. And about half the people who watch the video and do the counting task don't see the gorilla. I'm really interested in, my wife does a lot of it's a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness. Something that's right there in front of your eyes, but you don't see it. And obviously it's an important phenomenon. It's a lot of fatal accidents take place because people didn't see things that were right there in front of them. I said my wife does a lot of research in this area. She was talking to me about it one day, saying that there didn't seem to be any kind of personality type variables that correlated with inattentional blindness. And I mentioned on the previous slide this variable called absorption, people who become totally absorbed in what they're doing, that you measure with this standard pencil and paper test. And we kind of think, well, that ought to correlate, surely. You know, it sounds as if it should. And I was also intrigued by the fact that absorption correlates with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experience, because I'm very often faced with people who say, okay, then how do you explain what happened to me? And they'll describe their own personal paranormal, ostensibly paranormal experience. And very often it's the case, not always, but very often you think, well, yeah, maybe there was somebody else in the room who moved that book and you just didn't realise there was someone else in the room with you, or whatever else it may be. But people think, oh, no, I've seen that, I've noticed that. And you think, well, yeah, well, maybe you would, but maybe you wouldn't. You know, you're not familiar with this inattentional blindness research. So we thought it'd be interesting to look at inattentional blindness, paranormal belief, and absorption all in a single study, so that's what we did. We used a task that my wife had developed. We didn't use the gorilla clip. We had black letters and white letters bouncing around the screen. And people are told to just count the number of times the white letters hit the edge of the screen, ignore the black letters, and then a red cross moves slowly across the background. It's there for 7 seconds in full view. You will definitely see it if you weren't doing the counting task. But when you are doing the counting task, then typically about half the people don't see it. So we were interested in the differences between the inattentionally blind and the non-inattentionally blind. And we found, as predicted, that the inattentionally blind scored higher than the non-intentionally blind on both absorption, just measured on a standard questionnaire, and paranormal belief and experience, again measured using a standard questionnaire. And we thought, that's interesting, we should try and replicate it, which we did. But in the second experiment, we also included a measure of working memory capacity. This is the kind of memory that you use if you have to hold lots of information in mind at once and try and manipulate it, say doing some complex bit of mental arithmetic or something like that. And we found that the people who didn't see the cross had lower working memory capacity, which again makes sense. If the idea is if you're using all your cognitive resources on the primary task, you've got nothing left over to pick up on what actually is an irrelevant stimulus. It's not relevant to what you've been asked to do. Okay, so that's quite interesting. One of my favourite examples of what I think is almost certainly a false memory relates to claims of alien abduction. We published a paper back in 2008 where we compared a group of people who claimed that they had had alien contact with a very well-matched control group, including my mum, who doesn't claim she's actually in contact. And we found our experiencers, that's the politically correct term, by the way, scored higher than our matched controls on dissociativity, absorption, fantasy proneness, and various measures of paranormal belief and experience. They also reported a higher incidence of sleep paralysis, which I'll say more about in a minute because it's really interesting. But for now, in case any of you are not familiar with what happens during a typical alien abduction, but I suspect you probably are, this is a description from an article in New Scientist by Susan Blackmore back in the mid-90s, and it's a composite based on various cases that she'd been sent to her, people she'd interviewed, other cases she'd read about, and so on. She says, so here it is. I woke up in the middle of the night, and everything looked odd and strangely lit. At the end of my bed was a 4 feet high grey alien. Its spindly, thin body supported a huge head with two enormous, slanted, liquid black eyes. It compelled me telepathically to follow and led me into a spaceship along curved corridors to an examination room full of tables on which people lay. Now these are the little critters, they're called greys, about 4 foot high, big black eyes, communicate telepathically, and they're about to put that probe somewhere interesting. Goes on, I was forced to lie down while they painfully medically examined me, extracted ova, or in the case of men, sperm, and implanted something in my nose. Nobody knows what these implants are for. Some people think they're mind control devices. Some people think they're just tracking devices, the same way that we might use a tracker in a study of wild animals, so we know where they're migrating to or whatever. They know where you are so that they can abduct you again when they want to. I could see jars containing half human, half alien fetuses and a nursery full of silent, sickly children. When I eventually found myself back in bed, several hours had gone by. And here they are, putting in one of the implants. I should say, by the way, these are drawings, they're not photographs. I got a really nice example of distorted memory from one of the students one year. It's an exam question on the psychology of alien abduction claims. The student had slightly got the wrong end of the stick and had written one of the most famous cases of alien abduction was when Sue Blackmore was abducted by aliens. She was taken on board a spaceship where she was painfully medically examined, her ova were extracted and stuffed up her nose. Anyway, I mentioned how do you end up with these kind of weird memories? One important factor, that doesn't account for all the different cases, but it does account for a lot, is something called sleep paralysis. Now, sleep paralysis, in its most basic form, is very, very common. We typically find that about 40% of our first years indicate they've experienced it at least once. There'll be lots of people in this room who have experienced it. It's when you're half awake and half asleep and you realise that you can't move. Can you put your hand up if you've ever had that experience? You need to see a psychiatrist urgently. It's a bit disconcerting. It's not correlated with any kind of serious psychopathology. It's a bit disconcerting. Most people report that after a few seconds they're going to snap out of it and they're okay. About 1 person in 20 gets associated symptoms that make it a lot scarier. So these typically include a sense of presence. You feel as if there's something or someone in the room with you. And whatever it is, it doesn't mean you any good at all. You might also get auditory, visual or tactile hallucinations. You might hear voices or mechanical sounds or footsteps. You might see dark shadows or lights moving around the bedroom. Or you might see monstrous figures. You might feel as if you're being held, or as if you're being dragged out of the bed, or as if you feel breathing on the back of your neck and all the time you can't move. So it can be really, really, really scary. There's difficulty breathing. People report this kind of pressure on the chest, and people feel they're going to die. It's an intense fear. We know pretty much in general terms what causes sleep paralysis. The typical sleep cycle, you go through various stages: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. And during going through those phases, your breathing rate changes, your heart rate changes, your brain waves change. And then you come back up through them again, and then you go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And it's during REM sleep, which is typically associated with vivid dreaming, that the muscles of the body are actually paralysed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream. And we have that kind of cycle, it takes about 90 minutes, and as you go through the night it's repeated, and as each cycle is repeated, there's relatively more REM sleep and relatively less non-REM sleep. But what seems to be happening with sleep paralysis is something's gone slightly wrong. And to put it very simply, your brain's woken up but your body hasn't. So you are, first of all, you're aware of the fact that you're in your bedroom, you can see the surroundings, you can't move, and then you've got all this weird dream imagery coming through into normal waking consciousness, and your mind's doing its best to try and make sense of what's going on. So it's not too surprising that it's a very, very scary experience. But in one sense, we all go through sleep paralysis every night. It's just that when we're going through it, our consciousness is in the dream. We're aware of what happened in the dream, not realising we're lying in bed and we can't move. Anytime you talk about sleep paralysis, you are contractually obliged to show these pictures by Fuseli from the 1780s. I mean, this picture known as the Nightmare, it was a classic at the time, and still you'll see it around today. It's a wonderful depiction of sleep paralysis. You've got the you've got the pressure on the chest, you've got the monstrous, terrifying figures. And interestingly, if you are susceptible to sleep paralysis, you're more likely to have it if you sleep on your back than if you sleep in any other position. But to be honest, if you sleep in that position, it's just silly. 10 years later, you did not learn anything, just it's interesting again looking at sleep paralysis and different cross-cultural interpretations of the same basic core phenomenon. I mean, again, there's literally dozens and dozens of examples from around the world, I'll just give you 2 or 3. Most people in our kind of modern Western society have never even heard of sleep paralysis. So if you're suffering from it on a regular basis, you might, and particularly getting the vivid form, you might think, well, either it's real, and therefore you end up believing in ghosts, demons, alien abductions, whatever, or that you're going crazy. Neither, you probably marginally prefer the idea that it's real. But in other cultures, they do have a label and an interpretation for it, typically a supernatural one based on folklore. So in Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits on the sleeper's chest and suffocates them. In Japan, it's Kanashibari, again a nocturnal spirit attack. In St. Lucia, it's really spooky, very creepy. It's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. So, do all sleep well tonight, won't you? Back in Europe in the Middle Ages, it was sex-crazed demons who would come and have their wicked way with you while you slept. I'm sure it's unlucky. The male version was the incubus. Incubus literally translates as one who crushes. And the female version was the succubus. I don't know which of the two of them is more shocked. How do you get from that, scary though it is, thinking that you've been taken on board a spaceship and have probes put in interesting places? Well, if you read the UFO literature, you will very often come across the opinion that these aliens are able to wipe your memory of the actual abduction experience. So the only thing you might recall is the very early stages where some of that kind of weird stuff about not being able to move and a sense of presence and seeing lights in your room and so on. That'll be the only thing you can recall. If you read that, oh my God, that's what happened to me. I must have been abducted by aliens. You might, it gives you an explanation. It says you're not crazy. So it's got a certain attraction. You might then be tempted to go and seek out the services of a hypnotist and undergo hypnotic regression in the mistaken belief that hypnosis provides a key to unlock hidden or repressed memories. It doesn't. What it actually does provides a context in which you end up producing a narrative based on fragments of real memory, fantasy, imagination, expectation, bits of things you've seen in films, read in books. It's all woven together and it feels very real. And so if you go into these situations thinking that you've been abducted by aliens, there's a good chance that's the memory you'll recover. If you go into these situations thinking that you've got the problems you have at the moment because you were Mary Queen of Scots in a past life, you'll probably recover a past life memories of being Mary Queen of Scots. If you think you've got the problems you've got because you're the victim of ritualised satanic abuse, that's probably what you'll recover. It's the same techniques that are being used in all these different situations. So we be very, very cautious. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a few fairly light. I mentioned top-down processing earlier, so I'm not going to say too much more about it. It's the way that beliefs, your memory, your expectations can influence the way that you perceive ambiguous stimuli. I mean, generally it's a good thing that we are so good at recognising patterns and picking up on cause and effect relationships, but sometimes we overplay it and we end up seeing things that actually aren't really there. And one of the things that there's a phenomenon called pareidolia, a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. Now, one of the things that we tend to see in the visual domain is faces. Okay, so you look at the clouds, you look at the pattern on wallpaper, you look at the grain, wood, and so on. We very often will see faces. Faces are hugely important stimulus in so many ways, but sometimes we see faces when they aren't really there. So I'll just give you a few kind of fairly light-hearted examples. This is Selkirk Park, where Crystal Palace plays, an aerial photograph, and some people think they can see a Turin shroud-like image of Christ. So we wondered if they were just rename the ground, I don't know. This is a woman who discovered an image of Christ in the burn marks on her burrito, and she's obviously absolutely overjoyed by the discovery. This is a classic. This is Nun or Bun, the Immaculate Confection. This is a cinnamon bun that some people think bears a striking resemblance to Mother Teresa. See that? This is a more recent example, a grilled cheese sandwich which someone took a bite out of and then thought they could see the Virgin Mary looking back at them. So put the sandwich in a plastic bag on a bedside cabinet for 10 years and then sold it for $28,000. So it is worth keeping your eyes open. Now I'll need to explain the caption for this one. This is a computerized tomography scan of, I think it must be a left testicle in a guy who had an undescended right testicle. His right testicle hadn't dropped. And the medic who wrote the paper up said, well, you can see why the right testicle hadn't dropped, because would you want to share a scrotum with that? This is one which, when I first came across it, I saw immediately what it was about, and then realised after I've shown it a few times that not everybody in the audience does, but I'll explain the background. This is an image that Salvador Dali, the Spanish surrealist painter, came across and was leafing through some images, and he thought he discovered a new painting by Picasso. He thought, well, a new image of a painting by Picasso. He immediately saw this as a face in the style of Picasso. And I saw it that way. How many people see that as a face? Yeah. Quite a lot of people, not everybody. It's quite interesting. These are the eyes. That's the nose. Lips, mouth, chin. Eyes, nose, mouth, chin. Again, well, obviously not everybody does, but I did straight away, so I was quite surprised when I realised that half the audience didn't see it that way. But if you do, he then Dali realised he was holding the image the wrong way around. Turn the right way around, and it's a picture of an African village. So as I say, I'll just go back to the, you know that? He put it the right way around, that's what we're looking at. Which then inspired Dali to actually produce his own version of it. This is Paranoid Village that he painted in 1931. Okay, the most convincing, the most powerful example of top-down processing that I'm aware of relates to the claim that there are satanic messages in rock music. This is an idea that's put about by Christian fundamentalists, particularly in America. And the idea is that you can't hear these satanic messages when you play the record forwards, but if you play the record backwards, then you will hear the messages. And they believe that the messages can still have an influence on people even when you play the records forwards. Again, no evidence to support this whatsoever, not a silly idea. There are various websites you can go to listen to this stuff. One of the things that strikes you is that typically you can't hear what the message is until either someone tells you or you read what it's supposed to say, and then you listen to it again and think, oh yeah, I can hear it now. But again, it's top-down processing. Once you've got the expectation there related to what you should hear, then you can hear it. But without that expectation, you are a little bit lost. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to play, this is the best example I've ever come across. This is Top of the Satanic Pops. It's great. Clip from Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. I'm first of all going to play it forwards, for no other reason really than I like it, to be perfectly honest, but I do, so I will. Then I'm going to play it backwards, and my prediction is this, that mostly it will sound like backwards gobbledygook, for the very good reason that that's what it is. But you will hear, one or two of you at least, will hear one or two words. But then I will give you the full message. And it's about 30 words long, I think, about a 30-word paragraph. And I'll play it again. The second time I play it, you will hear the message as clear as a bell. You will wonder how you missed it the first time. The reason you missed it the first time is because it isn't there. Okay? But anyway, here we go. So, there's the clip. I'll play forwards first.
If there's a muscle in your head, don't be alone there. It's just this quickly for the bakery. Yes, there are two paths you can go back, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on.
Now, under the ethical guidelines of the British Psychological Society, if you do not want to run the risk of becoming the next recruit to Beelzebub's army, then you can leave the room now. It's too late for me. I actually go around singing the backwards versions myself, so I've had it. But if you're willing to take the risk, so am I. So here is the backwards version. So listen out for the satanic message. Anybody pick any words up? Satan, yeah. And again, it's top-down processing. What we're talking about, satanic messages, what's the word you're most likely to hear? Satan. And indeed you do. Now, this, that's right, is the full message. Here's to my sweet, according to those who think there's a message there. Here's to my sweet Satan, the one whose little path would make me sad, whose power is Satan. He'll give you 666, supposedly the devil's number. There was a little tool shed, I explained the tool shed, where he made us sucker, sad Satan. I'm now going to play the same sound clip again, and this time you will hear that message. That's not ahead of time over that. And you can actually show your friends that, because it's very easy. You just type Stairway to Heaven backwards. We don't literally type Stairway to Heaven backwards, but you type Stairway to Heaven backwards into Google. Lots of sites where you'll find that. There's a particularly good one by a guy called Eric Milner, because he lets you listen to it first without knowing what the messages are, and then puts the message up and you listen again. And do it the way that I did it, because that's the big contrast between the way it sounded the first time you listen and the way it sounded when you know what you're supposed to hear. Okay, I mean, just to finish off, sometimes people see anomalistic psychology as being in opposition to parapsychology, but I genuinely don't see it that way. I think that, personally, as I say, I'm not convinced that paranormal forces exist, but I might be wrong. And if the parapsychologists ever get to a point where they can prove that they've got evidence and it's reliable, replicable demonstrations of the existence of paranormal forces, anomalistic psychology would have done them a favour by helping them to sort the wheat from the chaff, to sort what only looks as if it's psychic from what genuinely is. Now, it might turn out that actually there is only chaff. That is what I personally think is the case. But if so, it's incredibly interesting chaff anyway. And at the end of the day, it may well be that the truth isn't out there, the truth is up here. Thanks for listening.
so pleased to have heard about sleep paralysis at last, because I thought I'd been suffering from poltergeist visiting in the night, so but thank you. It seems to me, Chris, that there's a real opportunity here for applying a lot of this to religion. You haven't really spoken about religion, but maybe we can get you back sometime and do that talk for us. Just something I forgot to mention earlier, I've got 2 pairs of sunglasses here which may have been left at a previous meeting. So if you recognise any of those, do come and collect them afterwards. We do need to finish at past, which is in 3 minutes' time, so I just need to psychically decide who's going to ask the first question, and I think it's Phil. So we really don't have long for questions, I'm afraid, Phil.
This will be a very brief one. Is that why, if you pick up a medical book, you discover you've got every disease in it?
That's exactly it, yeah. I mean, it's this notion of illusory correlations, and in this case, between what's written down the page and all the kind of little minor twinges and whatever that you may experience yourself. Exactly. The single most pervasive cognitive bias is what's called confirmation bias. And we all find it much easier to believe. I suppose this actually contradicts what I've just said, to be perfectly honest. Confirmation bias refers to the fact that we generally find it easier to believe things that we want to be true. Now, obviously, in the example you've given, we don't want it to be true, but we still can't help but think, yes, that's describing me. But in other situations, obviously, you're talking about people who are, say, looking for evidence of life after death or the existence of God or whatever. The evidence doesn't have to be that strong to convince people because we want it to be true anyway. And that's how lots of mediums can get away with doing what actually are kind of really very unimpressive readings, but people will still find them convincing because they want it to be true. So, sorry, it was a bit of a rushed answer, I apologise.
Some years ago I met Professor Arthur Ellison, who did a lot of research into the paranormal, and he came up with a theory, and I'd like your views on it, that the idea of a paranormal event taking place depended on the person doing it. In other words, if you believed in it, it would work. And if you didn't believe in it, he called such people an inhibitor. It wouldn't work. Now, in quantum physics, it's generally accepted that the observer can affect the effect of the experiment. I just wondered whether you thought, for example, if you hadn't been there in the tent with the dowsers, would they have done better?
It's a common argument that's put out by lots of parapsychologists. They believe that the experiments themselves can actually influence the situation. So you have certain people who are psi inhibitors. I would definitely come into that category, as was Susan Blackmore, Richard White, and all these other people, and people like Rupert Sheldrake and Marilyn Schlitz and Dean Radin would be in the other camp. There's a couple of comments on that. One is that at the end of the day, what that means is that skeptics are forever doomed to never witness these things with their own eyes, and just to have to, if it were true, to never witness these things with their own eyes. And just accept kind of second-hand accounts from elsewhere. There are ways that we can try and get at this. I mean, for example, Marilyn Schlitz and Richard Wiseman have worked collaboratively, running the same experiments, and in the first time they did it, Marilyn Schlitz got significant results and Richard didn't, which is quite interesting. But then in a bigger, better controlled replication, nothing across the board, so you end up not knowing. I mean, if it was a real effect, there are various different possible interpretations. One is that, the one the skeptics like is to say, well, the reason we don't get the effects that you do is because we do the experiments properly, and you don't control them properly, that's why you get these effects. Another possibility is it's all about rapport between the experimenter and the participants. if the skeptic kind of gives off vibes that indicate that I don't really expect this to work, you know, it's makes it less likely that it will actually happen, even if there is a real effect there to be had. Whereas kind of big, open, warm welcome from a parapsychologist who believes all this stuff might make it more likely it will happen. And another possibility, as I said before, that it might be the psychic vibes of the experimenter themselves. There are other kind of arguments that you can advance here, because according to people who believe in the existence of paranormal forces, they reckon that there should not be any effect of time or distance. And that would mean that the kind of existence of one skeptic anywhere in the universe at any point in time would be enough to dampen all paranormal activity. So clearly they don't really believe that. Most of the time, the experiments that I've done, I've had PhD students who've been total believers, and they wanted to prove me wrong. And I said, well, go ahead, let's see what we get. You know, the results don't support this. So it's not that I'm necessarily always doing the experiments directly myself. Sometimes it's my students who might be very strong believers, but they don't get positive results either. So there's something interesting going on there. I'm not quite sure what it is.
Are you, Chris, you have to take...
I can take a few more. I won't get to the station for just before 4, that's fine. So another 5-10 minutes if people want to.
Okay.
It's interesting too. You've clearly gone into the complexities of the brain and memory, and I think the fact that, well, it's just not understood in terms of scientific processes. You also didn't define what you actually meant by paranormal. And speaking to someone, who's from an atheist perspective, what I was just thinking about was that in terms of things like dowsing or clairvoyance or telepathy, that is it not possible that all that is just part of what our brains are capable of, and that there's a kind of big theory that because of just the way we live now, and well, our particular culture as well in the West, that we've lost a huge amount of what we were capable of, which many people, centuries ago or whatever, would have had because of the lack of outside influences and whatever. And there are, say, some cultures where those things that you have talked about, as I say, exactly, which you think that you addressed, but that is just part and parcel of that culture, and that would have been a kind of natural part of people's capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, again, interesting idea, and yeah, maybe, but there's quite a lot of evidence that would maybe suggest that's not really the case. Sometimes people used to say it's difficult to study these kind of non-industrial cultures, and even when you do, if you set up properly controlled tests, then the objection is always, well, of course you can't measure these things with your science. In which case, you're left with this thing of thinking, well, I just don't know. All I've got is anecdotes, and anecdotal evidence is not very convincing from a scientific perspective. Sometimes people use the same kind of arguments with respect to children. They say that children have these abilities, but we kind of educate them out of it. Well, people have done research with children. No, it turns out children are no more telepathic than adults. It doesn't happen. And as well, a final comment would be that if what you're saying is true, it would seem to be kind of odd that, from an evolutionary perspective, if we've got these amazing abilities, surely they'd have been selected for, not withered away and disappeared. I mean, if anybody can actually show that Aborigines, for example, can do these amazing things that sometimes it's claimed they can do, well, you're fine, that's new evidence, and let's look at it. But I just don't think the evidence is there, to be honest.
Thank you. This was quite some time ago, and I can't remember now exactly where it was done. I think it was in Sweden, but they had these 2 isolated pods, which were they had a name for it. In other words, free of any contamination or sort of thing. And they chose people because they believed this was the way. Either they'd been together almost all their lives and were still close, or otherwise really intense, new-formed relationship. And then they had the neuroscientists had the usual things on the head, and they would tell the one person in the one part, say a very scary story or something. And then, of course, they can show now that the part of the brain lights up. And at the same time, this partner of the other one was told nothing, just sitting there completely on his own. And at the same time, that same part of the brain lit up. Now, that's not evidence, but it shows there might be something happening.
I mean, I'd say it is evidence. And it's not the case. I mean, there is no evidence. Sometimes you'll get skeptics saying there's no evidence to support the existence of the paranormal. That's nonsense. Yes, there is evidence. It's the quality of the evidence and and most importantly, the reliability and replicability of the evidence that I think is what we need to focus on. So yes, I could trot out. I tell the students before I start teaching them my course, I could stand here and give you 20 hours of lectures that would convince you it was all real. I could do that. I know the literature well enough to do that. I'd be citing those kind of studies. The thing is, when I and other people try to replicate those studies, we don't get the same results. And it's not just the skeptics who don't get the same results. Very often people who really, really believe that they will get those results and want to get those results, they don't get them either. And that, I think, relates back to what I was talking about the whole issue of replicability in science. What you'd expect is that sometimes results will be published that actually are not really facts. And it might be that it's a statistical blip, it might be there's an unidentified methodological problem. At the moment within psychology there's a lot of focus on what are called questionable research practices. And this is not kind of out and out deliberate blatant fraud. It's just the fact that in any experiment, apart from really, really simple basic ones, there are a lot of choice points where you could choose to analyse your data this way or that way. You could transform your data or not. And we all kind of make decisions that we can then justify, but we're giving ourselves more than one bite of the cherry.
And sometimes what they do, what they are seeing as this part lighting up, they try and say that they're saying or thinking the same thing. It could just be thinking. It's not necessarily that I am scared.
Well, there are going to be a lot of very subtle artifacts that can creep in with these kinds of experiments. And again, what should happen and what does happen is that the skeptics, as the Fenn study, got huge attention around the world. And on reading it, you think, well, it doesn't seem, okay, it's not perfect, but the series don't seem to be that bad. But because it's such a controversial finding, people go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and you see there's more and more instances where you think, well, that's not best practice, and I shouldn't have really done that, oh, that's a bit dodgy. And it's the cumulative effect of all those little things that might end up making people... I'm sure Ben is totally sincere in claiming that these effects are real, but, as I said, the wider scientific community, there is so many failed replications now that I think we can dismiss that particular example, the one I talked about. But it will always be, in any science, you've got the challenge of trying to separate the signal from the background noise. And I think the interesting question is, what would science look like that was based on nothing but noise? And I think it would look like parapsychology. I genuinely do. I've not always been a skeptic, by the way, to be a believer, so maybe I'll go back again, who knows, but it'll take stronger evidence than parapsychology is currently producing to maybe do that.
Okay, yes, I think we'll... I know there are loads of people
That's the question while I'm backing away.
Yeah, but I think we need to draw things to a close. But don't forget to take one of those if you'd like the secret magic code. But please give another big round of applause to... We'll have our part 2 meeting a little bit later, so 20 minutes or so. Come back in here if you'd like to, but we hope to see you again soon. Thanks for coming.